January 17, 1945. Ziegenberg, Germany. The Adlerhorst. The concrete walls of the command bunker absorbed the cold like a tomb. Outside, the Ardennes Offensive had collapsed into frozen mud and burning steel. Inside, beneath the flicker of oil lamps and the hum of field generators, German commanders gathered around topographical maps that no longer made sense. The pins marking American positions had multiplied like cancer cells across France, Belgium, and the approaches to the Rhine. General Alfred Jodl placed his hands flat on the table, fingers trembling, not from fear, but from a realization that had crystallized into certainty over the past 4 weeks. The Americans were not fighting a war. They were operating a machine. On the wall behind him hung a captured logistics manifest, retrieved from a burned-out American supply depot near Bastogne. It listed, in meticulous typewritten columns, the daily allocation for a single American infantry division, 650 tons of supplies. Every day. 1 division. Jodl had read it 3 times, checking his own calculations against the impossible arithmetic. The entire German 6th SS Panzer Army, at the height of the Ardennes Offensive, had subsisted on less than 300 tons per day across all its divisions combined. The paper in his hand represented more than numbers. It represented a nation that had turned abundance into weaponry, logistics into lethality, and industrial capacity into an existential threat that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could overcome. The realization had been building for months, whispered in field reports and encoded in intercepted radio traffic, but it was here, in the aftermath of their final gamble in the West, that the full weight of American industrial logistics revealed itself not as advantage, but as an annihilating force of nature. To understand how thoroughly American logistics stunned the German command, one must first understand what the Wehrmacht expected when the United States entered the war in December 1941. German military doctrine, forged in the swift campaigns of Poland and France, emphasized operational mobility, tactical audacity, and the concentration of force at decisive points. Logistics existed to serve maneuver. Supply lines were kept short, armies lived partially off the land, and soldiers were expected to endure hardship as a fundamental aspect of combat. The German soldiers' daily ration, even in the early victorious years, averaged 3,200 calories when available, but it was frequently unavailable. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel was precious. Replacement parts for vehicles were cannibalized from broken machines. This was not merely the result of wartime shortage. It was embedded in German military philosophy. War was supposed to be decisive, quick, and won before logistics became a determining factor. The Americans, German intelligence assessed in 1941, would bring manpower and industrial potential, but they would need years to mobilize, and their civilian population, softened by prosperity and distance from war, would lack the stomach for prolonged combat. The German General Staff studied American performance in World War I and noted the inefficiencies, the confused supply operations during the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the reliance on French and British equipment. They observed American culture through a lens of contempt, a nation of gangsters and jazz, of undisciplined individualism, of mongrel races that could never match Germanic discipline and unity of purpose. When General Franz Halder received early intelligence reports about American production targets in 1942, claims that the United States intended to produce 60,000 aircraft and 45,000 tanks in a single year, he wrote in his diary that the figures were either propaganda or delusion. By 1943, those delusions were landing on European shores. The first shock came not in combat, but in observation. When Wehrmacht intelligence officers examined captured American supply depots in North Africa following the initial engagements at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, they found something that violated their understanding of military operations. warehouses stacked with crates upon crates of rations, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, all organized with industrial precision, all labeled in English and accompanied by detailed inventory lists. But it was the superfluity that bewildered them. They found entire pallets of cigarettes, not as luxury items, but as standard issue. They found coffee in quantities that exceeded the entire monthly allocation for a German division. They discovered canned fruit, chocolate bars, and packages of chewing gum distributed as routine components of the soldiers' diet. One captured logistics manual, translated and circulated among German staff officers, detailed the American, Type K, ration, 3 individually boxed meals, each containing not only caloric sustenance but items like toilet paper, cigarettes, sugar tablets, and water purification tablets. The manual specified that these rations were considered emergency provisions, inferior to the standard field kitchen meals. Colonel Friedrich von Mellenthin, who served as chief of staff for several panzer armies in North Africa and later on the Eastern Front, wrote in his post-war memoirs of the cognitive dissonance this created. "We had assumed that American wealth would translate into better equipment, superior tanks or aircraft. We did not comprehend that their wealth would translate into a logistical infrastructure that rendered their soldiers immune to the attrition that governed all previous warfare. They did not fight harder than we did. They did not need to. They fought from a position of such material abundance that individual tactical defeats became strategically meaningless." The German army had operated on the principle that war was a test of will, discipline, and tactical ingenuity, where victory went to the side that could endure greater suffering. The Americans were demonstrating that war could be reduced to a problem of industrial production and distribution, and they had solved it with the same ruthless efficiency they applied to manufacturing automobiles. The symbolic object that haunted German commanders throughout the war was not a weapon or a vehicle, but something far more prosaic, the jerrycan. Ironically, the Germans had invented it. The Wehrmacht's 20-liter fuel container, officially designated the Wehrmachtskanister, with its ingenious 3-handle design that allowed easy carrying by 1 or 2 soldiers, its air pocket that permitted the can to float, its robust construction that could withstand drops from significant heights. When the British captured supplies of these containers in North Africa in 1940, they immediately recognized the design superiority and began manufacturing copies, which they called jerrycans, in sardonic tribute to their German origin. By 1944, the Americans were producing jerrycans at a rate of 700,000 per month. They filled them not in scattered field depots, but in purpose-built fuel farms in England, where 120-octane aviation gasoline and 80-octane vehicle fuel flowed from pipelines connected directly to tanker ships, into storage tanks measured in millions of gallons, and then into jerrycans that were trucked to forward airfields and supply dumps in a continuous, unbroken stream. A German intelligence assessment from June 1944, recovered from Army Group B headquarters, noted with barely concealed desperation, "The enemy's fuel supply operates with the regularity of a civilian utility. Their tactical air forces consume more aviation fuel in a single day than the Luftwaffe receives in a month, and yet they never appear to be rationed." The jerrycan became a symbol not of German ingenuity, but of how thoroughly American industrial capacity had weaponized even the simplest logistics. The Germans had created the perfect container for scarce resources. The Americans had created infinite resources, and they filled German-designed containers with them, and they distributed them so abundantly that captured German soldiers reported seeing American troops use gasoline to burn trash, to sterilize equipment, to destroy lice-infested clothing, using as casual refuse a substance that German panzer commanders measured out in liters with the care of apothecaries preparing medicine. The true scale of American logistics became undeniable during Operation Overlord. When Allied forces invaded Normandy on June 6, 1944, German commanders initially assessed the operation through conventional military frameworks. They saw soldiers, tanks, aircraft, assets that could be destroyed or repelled through tactical competence. What they failed to comprehend in those first crucial days was that the invasion was not primarily a military operation, but an industrial installation transplanted onto French soil. Within 2 weeks of the invasion, the Americans had landed more than 50,000 vehicles. Within a month, they had established on the beaches of Normandy a logistics infrastructure that handled more daily tonnage than the port of Boston processed in peacetime. The Mulberry artificial harbors, massive floating docks towed across the English Channel and assembled under German artillery fire, had no precedent in military history. They were not merely innovative. They represented a nation with sufficient industrial excess to build disposable seaports. German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, received daily intelligence briefings that read like industrial production reports rather than military assessments. American supply dumps expanded by measurable acres each day. Fuel depots multiplied. Ammunition stockpiles grew faster than German artillery could diminish them. On July 15, 1944, von Rundstedt sent a situation report to Berlin that included a paragraph his staff had debated removing for its defeatist tone. The enemy's logistics do not represent a supply line that can be interdicted. They represent the wholesale migration of American industrial capacity onto the European continent. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an economy, and we cannot bomb, shell, or maneuver against an economy that outproduces us at a ratio that makes tactical considerations irrelevant. The report was filed and von Rundstedt was dismissed from command 3 days later, replaced by Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who arrived with Hitler's orders to fight with greater fanaticism. Von Kluge lasted 6 weeks before he too grasped the mathematical inevitability of the American logistical tide. He wrote a final letter to Hitler before taking cyanide on August 19, 1944, and in it he stated, "The enemy's superiority in material is so overwhelming that all our courage is expended merely in surviving from one day to the next." But it was in the autumn of 1944, during the great American offensives across France and the approaches to Germany, that the Wehrmacht experienced the full psychological weight of facing an enemy for whom supply shortages simply did not exist. German units, retreating across France, destroyed bridges, mined roads, demolished rail lines, and burned supply depots, standard military practice designed to slow pursuing forces and force them to pause while logistics caught up with combat units. These tactics had worked against the Soviets, who operated on precarious supply lines stretched across the vastness of Russia. They had worked against the British, whose island logistics were constrained by available shipping. They did not work against the Americans. When the Germans destroyed a bridge, American engineers, supported by dedicated engineering units equipped with prefabricated Bailey bridges, had the span rebuilt within hours. When German rearguards mined roads, American supply columns simply drove around them, across open fields, supported by bulldozers and graders that carved new roads through the French countryside as casually as plowing farmland. When the French rail system lay in ruins, the Americans built their own, the Red Ball Express, a dedicated truck convoy system that operated 24 hours a day, with marked routes and traffic control systems that moved 12,500 tons of supplies per day at its peak, more tonnage than the entire Wehrmacht moved by rail across all of occupied Europe on an average day. A German artillery officer, captured near Metz in November 1944, provided testimony during his interrogation that his American captors initially dismissed as hyperbole. He described watching American supply convoys from a concealed observation post during his unit's retreat. "For 2 days and 2 nights, the trucks passed without stopping. We counted them at first, but we lost count after the first 1,000. They moved with their headlights on, unconcerned about air attack because they owned the sky absolutely. Each truck was identical to the last, and the column stretched beyond the horizon in both directions. It was then I understood that we had lost the war not in 1944, but in 1941, when we allowed such a nation to become our enemy. No amount of tactical brilliance or operational success could overcome an opponent who could manufacture trucks faster than we could destroy them, who could train drivers faster than we could kill them, who could produce gasoline in quantities that exceeded the entire fuel production of the Reich. The testimony was filed and forgotten, but it captured a truth that German senior commanders had been reluctantly documenting in their reports. American logistics had achieved something unprecedented in military history. It had decoupled tactical success from strategic outcome. A German unit could win a battle, inflict casualties at a favorable ratio, destroy enemy equipment, and seize ground, and yet the strategic situation would deteriorate because the American capacity to replace losses and sustain operations exceeded the Wehrmacht's capacity to inflict them. The contrast between expectation and reality reached its apex during the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's final major offensive in the West, launched on December 16, 1944. The operation was conceived as a return to the Wehrmacht's glory days, a bold armored thrust through a weakly defended sector, exploiting surprise and tactical mobility to reach the Meuse River and the supply dumps beyond. German planners knew the offensive was desperate, a gamble with inadequate fuel reserves and dwindling ammunition stocks. But they believed, hoped, that American logistics, stretched across the width of Europe from Normandy to the German border, would finally prove vulnerable to a concentrated blow. The plan required German forces to capture American fuel supplies intact. Panzer units were allocated fuel sufficient to advance approximately 80 kilometers, roughly halfway to their objectives. They would, the planning documents stated, refuel from enemy stocks. This was not a contingency plan. It was the operational foundation. German success depended not on their own logistics, but on capturing and utilizing American logistics. The offensive initially achieved surprise and local success, penetrating deep into American lines and creating a bulge in the Allied front that gave the battle its name. German commanders, listening to radio intercepts and reading captured documents in the first days of the offensive, began to believe they might achieve the operational objectives. And then they encountered the American response, and the last illusions about comparative logistics died in the snow and mud of the Ardennes forest. The Americans did not respond to the crisis by rationing supplies or carefully husbanding resources for a protracted defense. They responded by unleashing the full capacity of their logistics system. Within 48 hours of the German breakthrough, the U.S. Third Army, consisting of more than 250,000 men and 50,000 vehicles, disengaged from offensive operations in the Saar, pivoted 90 degrees north, and redeployed more than 100 miles to strike the southern flank of the German penetration. This maneuver, executed in winter conditions over icy roads, required the movement of millions of gallons of fuel, hundreds of thousands of artillery shells, and the reorganization of supply routes to support armies moving in new directions. German planners, reviewing the intelligence, could not comprehend the operational tempo. General Heinrich von Ludwitz, commanding the XLVI Panzer Corps, wrote in his diary on December 22, "The Americans have moved an entire army across our front in less than 3 days, fully supplied and prepared for immediate offensive action. This is not possible by any standard of military logistics we understand. Yet it has occurred." Meanwhile, German panzer units, having advanced as far as 60 kilometers in some sectors, began to run out of fuel precisely as planned, but they found no accessible American supply dumps. The Americans, demonstrating a logistical flexibility that had no German equivalent, had either evacuated or destroyed forward fuel stocks, and simultaneously increased the fuel allocations to units defending critical points. At Bastogne, the encircled 101st Airborne Division, cut off from ground supply for a week, was resupplied entirely by air, receiving not only ammunition and medical supplies, but sufficient fuel, food, and winter clothing to maintain defensive operations without rationing. German soldiers, infiltrating American positions, sent back reports that their commanders filed with notations of disbelief. They described American soldiers in heated tents, drinking hot coffee and eating cooked meals, while German troops 3 kilometers away huddled in frozen foxholes eating stale bread and whatever they could scavenge. They described American aid stations with stocks of morphine, plasma, and antibiotics sufficient to treat thousands of casualties, while German medics operated with dwindling supplies of bandages and improvised antiseptics. They described captured American supply trucks, still loaded, which contained more food than an entire German company would receive in a month. The symbolic weight of the jerrycan returned here, in the frozen forests, where German panzer crews abandoned tanks not because they were destroyed, but because they had no fuel, and they marched past intact American vehicles, parked and guarded, with full jerrycans strapped to their sides. The abundance became a form of psychological warfare, each encountered supply dump and stocked warehouse a reminder that German soldiers were starving and freezing while fighting an enemy who would never experience shortage. By January 1945, when the German offensive had been crushed and the Wehrmacht was in full retreat toward the Rhine, the contrast between American and German logistics had become a source of dark humor among captured German officers. One Luftwaffe colonel, interrogated at a POW facility in France, responded to questions about German fuel shortages with bitter laughter. "You ask about our fuel situation as if it were a logistical problem. It was not a problem. It was a catastrophe. In October 1944, the entire Luftwaffe received less aviation fuel than a single American fighter group consumed. We had pilots. We had aircraft. We had tactical plans. We did not have gasoline. Meanwhile, your bombers flew missions with fighter escorts that outnumbered our entire operational fighter strength, and they flew every day, regardless of weather, regardless of losses, because you had infinite fuel and infinite replacement aircraft. We fought with accounting. You fought with abundance." The transformation in German military thinking was not merely an acknowledgement of material inferiority. It represented a fundamental reconsideration of what warfare meant in the industrial age. German doctrine had been built on Clausewitzian principles, war as an extension of politics by other means, where will, morale, and tactical genius could overcome material disadvantages. The Wehrmacht had defeated France, despite France's material superiority in 1940, through superior doctrine and operational execution. They had nearly defeated the Soviet Union, despite facing vastly larger armies, through the same principles. But American logistics represented something outside the Clausewitzian framework. It was not merely material superiority. It was material superiority of such magnitude that it negated the relevance of traditional military virtues. German tactical brilliance produced local victories that had no strategic meaning because American logistics could absorb losses and continue operations without pause. German operational audacity created breakthroughs that collapsed because German armies could not sustain their advances, while American armies, even when tactically clumsy or poorly led, ground forward with inevitable momentum, their mistakes corrected not by better training or inspired leadership, but by throwing more supplies, more replacements, more equipment at the problem until it was overcome through sheer material weight. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German panzer doctrine and chief of the General Staff from July 1944 to March 1945, wrote in his post-war memoirs with the analytical detachment of a defeated professional, "We made two fundamental errors in our assessment of the American military. First, we assumed that their material abundance would produce a soft, undisciplined force that would crumble under pressure. In fact, their abundance produced a force that could afford to make mistakes, absorb losses, and learn from experience without catastrophic consequences. Second, we assumed that logistics was a support function, subordinate to operations. The Americans demonstrated that logistics was the supreme operational capability, and that an army with unlimited supply could defeat an army with superior doctrine through the simple expedient of never allowing the enemy to recover, regroup, or resupply. The evidence of American industrial logistics extended beyond mere tonnage figures and supply statistics. It manifested in countless small details that, collectively, revealed a civilization at war with itself remaining fundamentally intact. German intelligence officers, analyzing captured American documents and interrogating prisoners, discovered that American factories producing war material had, throughout the war, simultaneously increased their production of civilian goods. The same industrial base that produced 300,000 military aircraft between 1941 and 1945 had also increased automobile production for civilian markets, had expanded consumer appliance manufacturing, had raised agricultural output to feed not only American forces, but Allied civilian populations across Europe. This was economically and conceptually impossible by German understanding. Total war, as practiced by the Third Reich, meant the complete subordination of civilian economy to military production. Rationing was severe. Consumer goods vanished from shops. Women and children were mobilized into war production. The entire society existed in a state of emergency mobilization. And yet Germany, with its entire economy militarized, could not produce sufficient material to sustain its armies in the field. America, simultaneously fighting wars in Europe and the Pacific, supplying Allied forces worldwide through Lend-Lease, and maintaining a civilian economy that provided its citizens with a standard of living higher than most European nations achieved in peacetime, operated at a level of industrial capacity that had no historical reference point. A German economics ministry report, circulated in late 1944 and recovered from Reich archives after the war, attempted to calculate American production capacity and concluded, either our intelligence sources are providing systematically inflated figures, or the American economy operates on principles we do not comprehend. The reported production levels would require impossible amounts of raw materials, electrical power, and labor. We must conclude either that the reports are false or that American industrial efficiency exceeds our own by a factor we cannot accept as credible. The reports were not false. American industrial efficiency did not merely exceed German capabilities. It existed in a different category entirely. The United States had entered the war with an economy already operating at high capacity, with infrastructure designed for mass production, with a labor force trained in industrial methods, and with access to raw materials that required no conquest to obtain. When American industry converted to war production, it did not cannibalize civilian output, it expanded total production capacity. New factories were built, new workers were trained, and the existing industrial base was leveraged with a sophistication that German planners, accustomed to resource scarcity and incremental optimization, could not match. The symbolic resonance of the jerrycan reached its final irony in the closing months of the war. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into Germany, they found German logistics depots filled with captured Allied equipment, warehouses of British uniforms, Soviet weapons, French vehicles, and tens of thousands of jerrycans, both German-manufactured originals and American-made copies, now empty, standing as monuments to an asymmetry that had become absolute. The Germans had invented the perfect container for scarce resources. The Americans had demonstrated that in modern industrial warfare, efficiency in managing scarcity was inferior to the simple abundance that made efficiency irrelevant. The epilogue to this revelation unfolded not in combat, but in the testimony of German officers during the war crimes trials and strategic bombing surveys conducted after the war. Stripped of propaganda and ideological posturing, facing the documentary evidence of their defeat, German commanders spoke with surprising consistency about the moment they understood the war was lost. It was not at Stalingrad, though that was a catastrophic defeat. It was not on D-Day, though that opened a second front they could not sustain. It was in the progressive realization, accumulating across hundreds of intelligence reports and frontline observations, that they were fighting an enemy for whom the normal constraints of warfare, supply shortages, production bottlenecks, manpower limitations, simply did not apply. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, one of Germany's most capable defensive commanders, testified during his trial. "We fought with great courage and tactical skill. We achieved local victories. We imposed casualties. None of it mattered. The Americans had so thoroughly solved the problem of logistics that they could sustain 3 major army groups in continuous offensive operations while simultaneously building up strategic reserves. They could afford to be wasteful, to make mistakes, to lose battles, because their logistics ensured that tomorrow they would be stronger than they were today, while we would be weaker." This was the transformation that American logistics had wrought. It had converted war from a test of martial virtues into a problem of industrial production, and in doing so, it had revealed that the United States possessed something beyond military power. It possessed systematic abundance, the capacity to produce goods in such quantities that waste became tactically acceptable and strategic dominance became inevitable. The German commanders had expected to fight American soldiers. They had prepared to counter American weapons and tactics. What they encountered instead was American civilization itself, transplanted onto European battlefields in the form of supply depots that never emptied, fuel dumps that never ran dry, and replacement streams that never ceased. They were not defeated by superior tactics or braver soldiers. They were defeated by a nation that could feed, fuel, arm, and sustain 3 massive army groups simultaneously across thousands of miles of supply lines, without apparent strain or shortage, while that same nation's civilian population lived in unprecedented prosperity. In the final accounting, what stunned German commanders was not that they had lost, but how they had lost. They had lost to an enemy that never suffered, never rationed, never experienced the desperate expedients that